How are you doing, folks? Good evening. Fáilte go léir. You're all very welcome here this evening. Usual housekeeping, if you could just knock your mobile phone off the silent, maybe. And in the event of an emergency, just follow myself and Anne as we make a dash out through the doors, come in, up the steps and away to our left-hand side, right, and away we go. And if somebody would ring 3 9s in the meantime, we'd appreciate it, okay? Now, we've all cleared our throats, etc. Anybody want a sip of water there, we'll talk to Sheila and we'll organise that for you. If you hold on to any questions you have, if you just make a little note of them, if you just hold on to the end of the lecture. If we could, just next month's lecture, there's a slight change tonight because our poet, Michael Whelan, is extremely busy and May has been exceptionally hectic for him so far. So tonight, by no manner of means, we have a wonderful man here replacing him tonight. He's going to give us a talk on, as you can see, our language in Ireland, from Ogham to the present day. Now I thought we'd only bad language here in Ireland. We're from Tourette's. One American visitor I had staying with me on the bus said there were two senior people, a man and a woman, sitting behind him on the bus going into town, and he said he wouldn't have heard such language from a sergeant major who's come out with a pair of them on the bus going into town. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that comes into it somewhere at all. Maybe there's something in our history that causes that to happen. So that's next month's meeting. In the meantime, history must be believed to be true. I think all of you have believed so far in our series of lectures, which only goes to prove that our lecturers are the best lawyers anywhere in the land. Without further ado, give you John Doe.
Thanks very much, folks, and thanks again for inviting me back. This is the story of the history of our language. And I'm afraid tonight's presentation didn't start very well. Last night I was working on trying to decide what slides to put together. And the wife said to me, "Oh, you're off out again, are you? When?" And I said, "Tomorrow night." And she said, "Well, sometimes she turns up," and she's been here at 1 or 2. And she said, "Well, what's it on?" And I said, "Well, the history of the Irish language." She says, "It's boring. You'll bore them to death." So I'll check at the end, okay? It's a topic I'll actually like, and a topic I'm interested in. And to me, it's a detective story. And we'll talk about that as we get through it. But it's in a couple of different sections, and the first section is really about languages themselves. If we look at Europe, there are 4 major language types in Europe. The Basques with 1.7 million speakers. Hungary and Finland. Well, it's not really Finland because it stretches across from Sweden to northern Russia as well. 22 million speakers over there. But the vast majority are 400 million Indo-Europeans. And we're going to talk about them, so don't worry about it. But what I'm saying is there are language groups all over the world. In Europe, generally speaking, we have only 3 language groups. When we look at languages, we can see how many languages there are altogether so far counted. And this comes off a website, and it's quite recent. I looked at it about 2 weeks ago to get these numbers together. So, in Africa, over 2,000 languages. In Europe, only 200 languages. Total of 7,100. But the number of speakers of these languages is a bit different. Chinese, 1.2 billion. Okay, English, only 335 million. Russian, only 166 million. One of the interesting arguments I had with our friends from the US is that by 2080, English may not be the predominant language in the US. It's quite likely to be
Chinese.
Spanish. Oh.
So, there is a website. This is the website. I'm not too sure how many of you are interested in wandering around the web, but this particular website keeps all the numbers together, analyzes the various languages, identifies which ones are growing, which ones are declining, and provides things like planning guides for people who are interested in the survival of languages, policies that government should have in nurturing the minor languages, whatever else. Quite a good website. an awful lot of data in there, I'm afraid. Coming back to our own view of the world, we do know that our language is one of the Celtic languages, and we'll get to the definition of Celtic later on. And Celtic languages really are defined by these parts of Europe. If we look at Barry Conliffe, Barry's one of the archaeologists you see regularly on Time Team, and he rates this as about 400 BC. Now certainly the Celtic languages are older than that, and the theory is they came from Anatolia, which is the part of Turkey, the main part of Turkey, and probably dating thousands of years ago. But we're quite happy with the Celtic languages in this part of the world. In what we would today call England, there was a language called Britannica, and we'll come to that again. In most of what today is France, you had the Gaelic language. And a variant of that was in northern Italy, the Pontic. And that really is a language that went along the whole of the Po Valley, from about Venice up into the mountains towards Lake Como. And then over in this part of the world, you had a language called Celt-Iberian. Nobody's fallen asleep yet. How do we know about our language? Well, way back in the good old days, the Irish decided that they would write the story of the peoples of Ireland. And about the year 1200, a book called the Laur Gowalla appeared. And really, that was looking at how the various tribes came together and formed in the island of Ireland. And it talks about the 7 invasions that came from overseas and attempted to settle in Ireland. And the last invasion was Neil and his brothers from northern Spain. And there's still a lot of connections, Celtic connections between Galicia and Ireland. But part of that definition of who the peoples of Ireland were, and all of this is mythology, was the question of where the language came from. And Phineas was sent out to find a language for the whole of Ireland. And he spent 10 years collecting this language at the place where the Tower of Babel was built. By the time he got there, God had decided to have a go at the peoples who were trying to build the tower. And he had split them and divided them and made them all speak different languages. So when Phineas arrived, he went around each of the languages and picked up the best words of them all. So by the time he brought the language back to Ireland, it was the best language in the world, because all the words he picked up were the best available to mythology. But that's a story, and actually translations of the Laur Gowalla are inside here in the library for those who are interested. Where am I on my notes? We generally speak about our Celtic heritage and our Celtic language. Unfortunately, the word Celtic is only a recent word. It came out of the Romantic period and came out of Germany, would you believe. The word Keltoi is a really old Greek word for those tribes that lived around Anatolia, that I mentioned earlier, in Turkey. But the word Celtic is only a recent word and was never used in this part of the world until the middle 1800s. Well, probably the early 1800s and middle 1800s. And today it refers to all sorts of things. You have Celtic festivals for everything under the sun, from knitting patterns to music to dance routines. Anything you want can be described as Celtic. But the only genuine definition of Celtic is as a language or a language group. What we do know is that the language we call Gaelic was around this part of the world before the year 500 to 600 BC. But where did it come from? And how did it arrive? Lots of people have tried to guess when did it happen. The bottom one there, 4,500 years BC. Again, was that Barry Conliffe or the other guy? the expert, we can use this one. Oh no, Colin Redford, again another archaeologist. And this is one of the problems here, I mentioned at the bottom, but most of the people making these guesses are all archaeologists, and they're not linguists. Very few linguists have addressed this issue at all. Most of them are archaeologists. Barry looked at all of the things like the graves that we have made of stone, Newgrange, Pound of Rome, Harry Cooper, and said these stretch all through Ireland, all through France, in the around Carnac and what's that area called? France, northwestern France. Not Normandy, Brittany, yeah. And you find the same stones shaped graves in northern Portugal and in western Spain. You find them in Scotland and you find them in Norway. So Colin's view is that along the Atlantic coast there was a common culture. And because there was a common culture, he reckoned there was a common language. And his best guess as to when Gaelic arrived was 4,500 years. But really, we just don't know. It's a guess. Conliffe's article here is that taken together with what is known of similar languages once in use in central and western Iberian France until the time of Roman occupation, it's sufficient to suggest that the closely related language was spoken along the Atlantic seaways from Portugal to Britain by the middle of the first millennium BC. But they're all guessing. Now he's a very well paid guesser. Unfortunately, we can't help that. The major change that happened in European languages was the arrival of the Romans. Up to then, as we said, in what today we call France, you had Gaulish. North of that, you had the Germanic tribes, who had a variety of different languages. And south of that, in the Mediterranean areas, you really had Greek initially, and latterly Roman, Latin. Now, Latin really didn't make much of an impact until maybe a couple of hundred years before Christ, as the Roman Empire started to be built up. But once the Romans pushed into southern France and expanded around the Mediterranean, they brought their language with them. And like most occupations, and we should know this in Ireland, the Roman language was used for military reasons, administrative reasons, and trade. But the locals kept speaking their local languages. So in France, they spoke Gaulish as well as Latin. In Spain, they spoke Celtiberian as well as Latin. We do know the Romans never officially sent an army to Ireland. But we know from our archaeological finds that there was lots of Romans around Ireland, both as traders, as visitors, and there are 2 Roman burials in Ireland, one female in County Kilkenny. So the Roman influence was wide, and I'll talk in a little while as to how that changed language. What we can identify within our own language is that the Celtic language split into 2, and I'll show you what that difference means. Within a very short period before the arrival of Christianity, which was the next big change in our language. It split in 2 in that the island of the United Kingdom, is that what it's called today? Maybe not as united as it was a month or 2 ago, had Brittonic or P-Celtic. We're not including Scottish here. And that the other stuff, including Scotch Gaelic, was recalled Q-Celtic. This was purely a question of pronunciation. And we do know from our Irish, for those who remember it, that the way people in Donegal pronounced the word was very different from the way people in Kerry pronounced the word. And this was it here. The Brittonic word for head was pian, which today we would call pen. The Q-Celtic word for head was called cian. So the cup and the pop word, the Q and the P word, came into how people pronounce words. And that was identified quite early on as one of the very early changes to the Irish language in these islands. Can we date that change? Right? They're all having a guess, and that's all they're having. The oldest record for a Celtic language we have is from northern Italy. That Lepontic language that I talked to you about, right? This is it, written in Greek characters. And this is the translation. Okay, does it make sense? Not really. It's a fragment of stone with some carving on it. Greek letters, but in the Lepontic language. And this is dated to the 5th century BC. Now I come to the detectives. Most of the detectives are not Irish. Actually, none of the detectives are Irish. Most of them are German. But the first one was a Welshman. And he was a Welshman in a good job who didn't have anything to do with it. He was sent...
Probably worked with the civil service.
Sorry?
Probably worked with the civil service.
Of course he did.
Yeah.
He was a judge. Sent off to India. Had a great time. But he was a serious brain. In today's terminology, we'd call him a polyglot. Well, I don't know if you want to call him anything, but that's what he's called. He was interested in everything he saw in India. He had come across something that was totally new to him. And he translated anything in Indian back to English. In carrying out that translation, he started to spot things. Because he was Welsh, he could obviously speak and read Welsh, but English, and a little bit of Greek. And he had people working with him who were both Irish and Scottish. And he started to see connections between the stuff in India and the stuff this side of the world. And that intrigued him. And he reckoned there was a connection between the languages of India and the languages of Europe. So we come to our first example. The word for king in India is Raj. You've all read the stories about the Raj. Some of you would wish to have lived at that time. Unfortunately, we can't go back and make it happen again. And the great king was called a Maharaj. And then the Emperor of Kings was called Samrat. If we take the word Raj and look this side of the word, what do we get? A first cousin. Quite close to it. In Irish, Ri. In Gaulish, Rix. In Latin, Rex. And then Raj. And people were called, yes, you can pronounce that, Jerry. And you can see the word Raj coming through on Rix. This is Gaulish, so it links in through. And then when we look at today's word for king, so the only issue was, which was the first one? And he was able to tie back that the Indian words, Raj, written in Sanskrit, was much older than any of the similar words here. So we'll go on a bit. This worries me because I'm not too sure if you can read any of this. Is it too small? No. And can you see this at the back? Right, what I want you to look at is the Irish word máthar for mother and the Sanskrit word for mother. And just look up the line. My phone's talking.
Yeah. Amazing, yeah.
And what we find here is commonality in languages for core words. What you will not find common are words for smartphone or double-decker bus, or we're talking about core words. Mother, father, son, daughter. We're talking core words like bread, milk, water, birds, trees. So when you get down to core words, you find commonality. And what linguists spend their time doing is working out which was brought in and how did words change when they're brought into a language. Is this making sense, Sherry? There's a worried look in your face. We'll have a look at animal names. A cow. Bo, book, boo, what? Now, here we're starting to see the first changes coming in with English. English, I described earlier as a Brittonic language. But they're not holding on to the old Celtic words because we're getting the first impact of the Anglo-Saxon language. The Germanic words that came across with the Anglo-Saxons and got into the language as English was being put together. But in the old Celtic words, which I talked about earlier, you find a consistency. Even the word goat is Brittonic because of, now this spelling is Old Irish. I'm not going to go in and spend too much time talking about Old, Middle and Late Irish. I have a slide or two on it, but not too much. We never spell it that way, but don't worry about the spelling. Just look at roughly how the words are consistent across the languages. And in this I described language that affected these islands. I could go into Gaulish, I could go into Celtiberian. But a weird one popped up about 25 years ago in China. Tocharian. Now, I've got to go back to my notes on this because I want to get this right. Digging tombs on the Mongolian border in the desert. The Chinese scientists found graves with people's preserved bodies in there, mummies, clothing. But amongst the lot, they got 7,600 documents with writing on them. And they started to analyze the words in these. And they found a language with 3 variants. Now what do I mean by variants? Variants would be Donegal Irish versus Connemara Irish versus Kerry Irish. Still Irish, right? So there's 3 variants on this particular language. And they also found a commonality with other words this side of the world. And they started with dog, cow, pig, bread. And by analysing the words, they realised that the words for the Tocharian peoples and Celtic/Gaelic related to a period about the time of our Lord, or maybe 100 years before that. And these are the examples. What's the Welsh for river? By the way. What's the Irish for river? Avon. What river does the city of Bath sit on? Avon.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, even a word like river carries straight through. Dog. What's the Tocharian for dog? Coo. And the Irish. I bet you never knew this. Coo's a hound. Madra is a more recent invention. In that if you look at the old stories, and particularly in the time, Cuchulainn didn't have a dog. He had a... Yeah. So the Chinese scientists and European scientists got together and they've done a bit more digging. And they've started to do DNA tests on the mummies. And they're finding that they're having comparative signals with the DNA bones that have been found in this part of the world, and again dating to the time of our Lord or thereabouts. And the guess is, because nobody knows, is that these tribes, these 3 tribes, left Anatolia and headed east, the same time as the Celtic tribes came out of Anatolia and headed west, and eventually wound up in Ireland, stroke England, stroke Scotland, Wales, and the rest. You're not finding this too confusing. So, the scientists got together and put a map of all the European languages together. This isn't Wikipedia, and this is meant to frighten you, so I'll ignore it and move on quickly to the next one. But, in all honesty, just go back up, that really is the map of stringing all the languages together. And if I was to go into this in 6 months' time, some of the boxes will have moved up and down, and the lines will have gone somewhere else. In other words, they're always balancing how to work out when did that language start, what was its parent, and what are its children. No different than any other part of science. So this is it. We have Indo-European languages, plural. They use the word proto is before any evidence we have of it. This is how they're broken up. And here we have a crowd called Celtic. And they're broken up into all of these languages. This one down here is a weirdo. This is the language that was in southern Portugal before taken over by the Celtiberians. Okay? So it's an older language than Celtiberian, which is older than Portuguese. And then, as I talked about the P Celtic and Q Celtic, the two ones here. Now, I'm going to bring you back, I think I'm going to bring you back to your childhood on the next slide. I'm going to talk about another detective. Welshman. Went to Oxford University, spent 3 years studying and said, I'm fed up. So his dad was rich, and his dad gave him money. And he went off touring. And he toured Northern England, Scotland, came through Ireland, Wales, and then back to Oxford. And on his way, he collected anything he could lay his hands on. He collected plants, he collected manuscripts, he collected stories, but in particular, he collected languages. And when he got back to Oxford, he started putting these together, and he said, I'm going to write a big book on this. And he planned to write 12 volumes of a book. But the poor man died after the first one. And what he did really was, he started to put the Celtic languages together. Yeah, because he is Welsh, he was particularly interested in Cornish. And he was the first person anywhere who started to document the Cornish language, and at that stage it was suffering badly, tried to attempt its revival. Now, Cornish died in the 1700s, early 1700s. Manx only died quite recently. But he made a serious effort to revive it. And what he started off producing in Archaeologica Britannica in 1707 was the first Irish-English dictionary. Right? There never was one before, and there never was one in Ireland. What have I got? Gower, a goat. I have another one here somewhere. Oh yeah. Got a thief. Where is it? It's not, oh, there it is. Got a thief. So, words we know today popped up here in 1707. I actually have the whole of that book on my PC because you can download it free off the internet. The book itself is totally available for those nerds of you who actually want to start planning through Irish as it was in 1707. And it's the first instance of anybody writing anything in Irish. But I tell the lie, I have another one to come up later. Let's have a look at something we might understand. And I'd ask you to look at the Irish Our Father
And the Scottish?
are falling. Is it 80% similar? Or maybe a bit more? Sorry?
The amended.
All right. Well, if that's the only bit to remember, okay, you're doing well. The Manx is quite different, right? And I'll explain that later on as to how Manx evolved.
3 more of them.
And I won't ask anybody to stand up and do the Cornish one. Go back again just to have a look at those. Now, I don't know, any of you ever listen to or watch it on the telly, BBC Alba, the rugby matches? No? Or listen to it on radio? For my sins, I look at them. And I mean, he's speaking too fast, he's doing a commentary on the match. I can pick up maybe 20% of what he's saying. Right. Our next detective was a Frenchman. He was a priest. Worse still, he was a monk, Cistercian, who was supposed to be in the closed order, but didn't believe in rules for things like that. He was not really an academic investigator. He was just a curious guy who went out and about collecting stuff. And what he realized was he was able to pick up Gaulish words all over France, the northern part of Spain on the Mediterranean side, and obviously in the Benelux countries. So he reckoned he was able to put Gaulish together. And he started to build a direct dictionary of Gaulish words. Now, he's only interested in the rest of the Celtic language, was in Welsh. He never came to Ireland and understood Irish, Scotland, Manx, Cornish. But he then was able to trace back traces of Gaulish words as the Celts moved from Anatolia in Turkey, across Greece, into northern Italy, and then into Gaul. He was able to find inscriptions or wordings that was able to track that movement, that migration of peoples. We talk about migration of peoples, and the biggest one that's happening today is out of Africa again. Out of Africa is where, in theory, we all came from. Now that's a bit long time ago. A major event in all of this investigation was when the Grimm brothers got really upset. What really upset the Grimm brothers, well, Germany at the time was a load of statelets, not much bigger than our counties. Educated people in normal conversation spoke a local Germanic language. But when officialdom required any sort of speech, they spoke French.
Yeah.
And that pissed off the two Grimm brothers. So they said, we need to get French out of our elite system and get them all speaking German. So one of the ways, the two lawyers, and very successful lawyers, made lots of money. So they were able to fund themselves in lots of little schemes they had to revive the German language. When you think of that, revive the German language, they felt it under threat at the time. What they did was, they went round the big houses and they got the nannies who used to put the children to bed and put them down in the kitchen, and they wrote down all the stories that the nannies told to the children before they put them to sleep. And out of this came all the stories we know of. Now, the problem with the stories of the Grimm brothers today is they're extremely sanitized. Disney has done damage to the original Grimm stories because they were grim in lots of little details. You know, they're not all happy, clappy stories at all. But they started to publish these stories in an effort to get German more widely known within Germany. And because of their wealth, they were able to sponsor the same sort of events happening throughout Europe. And one of the strange things was that they came across people collecting stories in Ireland. Oscar Gaelic. And they published them in German. And they published them in France. And they published them in English. And suddenly, folk tales started to permeate Europe. And behind all of this was a language. German, French, the Nordic countries, and particularly Finland, the stories that came out of the Sami tribes in northern Finland, and they're still there today. Ireland. One of the stories that they obviously wrote was Cinderella. When the Irish Folklore Commission finished collecting, probably in the 1950s or maybe 1960s, and many versions of Cinderella they defined throughout Ireland. Over 380. So you ask yourself, how did the Cinderella story ever get to Ireland? If the first recordings of it in writing were in Germany. So these stories, the core stories of things like Cinderella, go back much further and belong to the arrival of a language itself. So when languages arrived, stories arrived as well. And in Ireland, we've a whole lot of stories that go back thousands of years, not only to Central Europe, but also to our friends, the Indo-European languages in Sanskrit. And there's a famous story, which I won't give to you, about the unfaithful wife. That is a Sanskrit story, turns up in Italy in the 1200s, turns up in Germany in the 1600s, and there's 16 versions of it in the rest of Ireland. The core story is the same, the people's names are slightly different, the ending it might be slightly different, the core story is the same. And it's like our words, the core words are the same.
And of course, the Zalvi is the woman's about.
Did you read it or did you Did you write it?
Am I in it?
No, that's far more interesting. Macpherson was a crook. Us Irish reckon he was a crook. But he helped the spread of the folk tales. Scottish guy, went through the Scottish Islands, collected stories of Oisin, and said, Oisin is Scottish. Now we know Oisin is
Irish.
and he published these. Not only that, but then he said, well, I've only 25 stories of Oisin. I'll write another 25 myself and claim they're originals. And they weren't. So really, as an academic, he's discounted. But the stories he published about Oisin again generated huge interest across Europe. And they said, we want to know about this Oisin fellow. And then they found dozens of Oisin stories right through, mainly Ulster in Ireland, and maybe Donegal, North Mayo. A lot more stories about Oisin that Macpherson never found. But he was a crook. Franz Bock, 1839. The only reason he's of interest is that this is the first time we ever see the word Celtic. The word Celtic had never been used up to there. They have investigated and they go back and they find it in Greek mythology. So it goes back to the Greeks. But after that, never found it again. Zeus. Now, his story is interesting. I'll go on to the next slide and come back. He never visited Ireland. Okay, just take that for granted. But he got very interested in the old books that he found in monasteries all through Europe. And I'll come to that map again. What he found in these books
were little notes written on top. You see them? Small handwriting. Down the margins here, down here again, down here again. And he said to himself, what the hell is this? The documents are in Latin, but these little marginal notes were in a language he'd never come across before. He didn't know what they were. And almost to the day he died, he never put a name on them. But he was dead curious about it. And these are the famous glosses. And what were they? Irish monks teaching European people church and law and medicine throughout Europe. And these were the teachers' notes in Gaelic, explaining a bit of formal text that needs to be taught to the students. The glosses were really to help the teacher explain detail to the students. So he was intrigued with this. Now, I don't know how many of these monasteries he visited. I picked this up off the web, and it says this is where all of the Irish monks came out of Ireland and established monasteries or abbeys or whatever else. Most of them are fairly familiar. As part of my work life, I spent a couple of months really working in Eastern Europe, and I worked in Kiev in Ukraine. And I never knew that there was a monastic established there, established by an Irish monk. So I don't know if this map is true or not. I'd love to go back and try and work out, was that true? So, he was using the glosses, understanding the Latin and reverse engineering from the Latin into Gaelic. And he published a grammar of Irish in 1833. And really his work is regarded the start of Celtic studies. You never heard about him, and you may never hear about him again. And this is his grammar. Now, unfortunately, it's Latin and Irish. So I'm happy you can't read that. This is the type of library he found those old books in. And those old books stayed in those libraries up until very recently. It's only recently in northern Italy that most of these books have been taken out of monastic libraries and put into museums. Most of them heading from Milan. But that library can be visited today. St. Gall. Frenchman. He was mainly interested in mythology. So going back to the story of Cinderella, he spent his time looking at the stories and trying to work out how these stories moved from country to country and how they changed as they went from country to country. So he was able to reconstruct the stories from start to finish. And he only died recently. Let's go back to Irish and we'll show you a few examples. Today they talk about really these ones down here, Old, Middle and Early Modern Irish. Primitive Irish really is our friends. Alright, I'll show you the examples of the English ones first. So you have three patterns of development in each one. Primitive Irish, which is really Ogham stones, and then the written Irish as it developed up to the early Middle Ages really. Modern Irish starts in 1600s, and I'll explain why it's regarded as Modern Irish then. English was more or less the same. English was quite late started. Up to that, in England, they spoke mainly Anglo-Saxon, with some Britannic. Oh no, I'm going the wrong direction, sorry about that. And there's an example of early English from Canterbury's Tale. Now, can you work out English from there? This is the translation. Early English. If you look at it and ignore the spelling and use the sound of the word, you can get there. Difficult enough. But it shows the evolution of language. from about 700 AD to today. Our primitive Irish, lots of bone stones, there's about 400 altogether. They had a very restricted alphabet. They couldn't chisel an O or a C or a B. They could only do it in straight lines. Now they had them at the slant, they had them crossing one another, but really they had a very limited set of characters. And in the Book of Ballymote, do you remember we went to the Royal Irish Academy and the Book of Ballymote was opened on the left hand side for those who saw it on the day trip? Unfortunately that page wasn't open at the time, but that's the page where in 1600 somebody recorded the Ogham alphabet was. As I said, about 400 in all. Strangely, there are 40 in southern Wales and 10 the other side of the Severn in England or western England. And that relates to the migration of the Déisi from the Waterford region into southern Wales, and some of them went down to Cornwall. Old Irish, and we have two examples there, Laura Nahudra and the Book of Leinster. And again, there's some early glosses in that as well. If you look at it again and ignore the spelling, you can work out what the words were. Middle Irish to the 1300s, and includes all of the documents that came through with the Ulster Cycle, the King's Cycle, a whole series of documents, maybe about 800 of them in all, from that period. As you know, most of these were written in monasteries by monks initially. Then professional writers came along and copied the stuff that was in the monasteries, and the monks stopped writing it themselves. The very early ones were Latin only, and then Gaelic was introduced. And early modern, right. For the first time we see the emergence of dialects in Ireland, and we're able to establish the differences between Ulster, Connacht, Munster. And we'll talk about why there's no appearance of Leinster a little later on. When Queen Elizabeth wanted to impress the O'Donnell, she learnt Irish. And when he visited her in London, this is the first Queen Elizabeth, she addressed him in Irish. And these Irish, Latin and English. And these are the English words of that time, and these are the old Irish words of that time. Again, you can just about work out when they work. The development of Irish stopped from the 1600s onwards. The language started to just stay static. And the reason for that, what's my slide now? Okay. The reason for that really was the flight of the Earls. With the flight of the Earls, the learned class of Ireland went with the Earls. The most important part of that was that the people who would do the writing and who were supported by the Earls had no income. So they never got money to write new books, new stories, new anything. So in general, all of our old material stopped being written after the flight of the Earls. It wasn't that any other language took over. It just was nobody developed the Irish language beyond that point. So it was spoken. And particularly with the monastic colleges in Europe, Louvain, Rome, etc., where Irish people went over to be trained as priests, they wrote in Europe, but they didn't write back in Ireland. What I want to talk about now is how changes happen within languages themselves. How do languages change? And particularly on loan words, how do words come into language? And can we trace those loan words back? And I want to talk about what Latin came in with Latin, the Vikings, the Norman French and English. When Christianity came to Ireland, it wasn't the Romans that arrived. It was generally Irish people who brought with them a new language and a new religion. That new religion referred to words that the Irish didn't have words for. So the concept of hell was never there in the Irish language before. The concept of church was never in the Irish language before the arrival of Christianity. The concept of priest wasn't there before. We had druids. So suddenly within the Irish language we're starting to see new words that relate entirely to the arrival of Christianity with Latin. What happened when the Vikings arrived? The major impact on Ireland with the Vikings was the introduction of towns. We didn't really have towns up to then. And the introduction of trade. As you know, Dublin was the biggest slave trade that the Vikings had in Western Europe. Kiev in the Ukraine was the biggest slave trade town that they had in Eastern Europe. But a whole lot of words came in at that time that the Irish never had words for up to then. So you see the Norse words and the Irish words and the English words. Oops, better get going. And particularly a word like market. We hadn't a need for a word like market before. And the word for penny arrived with the Vikings. Here's another selection of them. Pound, gyre, instead of coup. And they gave us some surnames. And they gave us place names. Now again, most of these, the main one that never retained its Viking name was Dublin, Dublin, or Ballyaughly. Both names are still valid. Whatever Viking name was there for Dublin, it never remained. The same with Limerick. And it went the other direction. The Norse princes established themselves in Iceland, and well, there was a row in Norway, and they were told to get out of Norway, and they wound up through the Hebrides, arriving up in Iceland, and eventually they went across to Greenland, and eventually they went down to Newfoundland. But in Iceland, there was a huge connection between Ireland, and there was mainly intermarriage that brought Irish females into Iceland, and with them came names. So the name Breen arrived in Norse. There are 85 Irish personal names written up in the Icelandic sagas, mainly the Nails saga, and there's 40 Icelandic place names with a Gaelic element. The first Normans arrived here spoke French. They wrote in French. Reasonably quickly after that, English started to appear, but a lot of words came in that we never had before. We never needed the word treasure, or plaintive, or miracle. Came with the French language. And likewise, we've given a few Irish words to the English language. There's a book out there by P.W. Doyle, English as We Speak It. And it's a fascinating book about how the English language has impacted on Irish thinking and how the Irish language has impacted on the English language. Henry VIII was the first one who decided, I must get rid of this language. and he tried his damnedest. One of the things he had was the policy of surrender and regrant. In other words, you're an Irish chieftain. If you give me your land and say you'll follow me, I'll give you your land back, and you can have it, and no problems. But on clause 27 on page 85, it had a little line that says, get rid of the Irish language. So that was part of the deal. And it was the first really official concerted effort to get rid of the Irish language. But they also wanted to attack the bards, the brevs, the filly, that educated class in Ireland who would be likely to promote the Irish language and just get rid of it. And in the destruction of the monasteries, we know that thousands of manuscripts were destroyed as well. Oh, that's the slide I wanted from the slide, the Flight of the Earls. But really, that was the start of where the Irish language just plateaued out at its max. Why do people change language? Why do they accept a different language? And this is particularly for the Irish element of it. People who spoke Irish were reckoned to be an inferior class. If you wanted to move on in life and to be able to speak in public affairs, or go to the post office, or meet with the sheriff, you had to be able to speak in English. So it was needed for all sorts of things, but particularly social advancement. And we know that in the 1700s, 90% of people living in Ireland spoke Gaelic, including the English people who were here. Down to 25% the 1850s and 5% 1900s. As I said, many efforts were made to get rid of Irish. Nearly all of them failed. When the Normans arrived, they tried. And particularly in the Statutes of Kilkenny, they said, let's get rid of Irish. Statutes of Kilkenny, written in French, not in English. There are parts of the very early English still survive, mainly in County Wexford, the language of Yola. When the settlers started, the plantation of Ulster, plantation of Ogham, most of those settlers wound up learning Irish and forgetting whatever language they came with. And then, as I said, from the penal laws onwards, strong efforts to try to get people speaking English. Garrett Fitzgerald, in one of his lazy days, decided to have a look at how quickly did the Irish language disappear. And he went back to small censuses, not of full official censuses, dating back to the 1700s. And he put together a few graphs and maps, and I'll show them to you. This one is 1851, and it shows that in that time, in Leinster, it was nearly all English speaking. In Ulster, mainly because of the Scottish Gaelic influence, again, English. But for the vast majority of people, and the majority of people were in the Gaelic-speaking periods, these counties had huge populations up to the time of the famine, Gaelic speaking. Now you won't notice that difference. So there is a bit of a difference between 1851 and 1871. The way the English treated Scotland was different from the way they treated the Irish. In Ireland, they abolished the chieftains with the Flight of the Earls. In Scotland, they retained them. But at the end of the day, the language has disappeared more in Scotland than it has in Ireland. The Welsh is a different story altogether, because the Welsh and the English were more accommodating to one another than the Irish or Scots were to the English. But particularly with the Scottish chieftains, they liked the high life that they had in London. And they moved from Scotland to London and wanted their huge estates in Scotland to support their lifestyle in London. So they cleared them, and you had the fantastic or horrible Scottish clearances that went on for a period of time. If Irish ever disappears from the country, it won't be gone altogether. Because surprisingly enough, most of our place names have an Irish element. The word Tala will never disappear. The people in Tala may never remember in the future a word of Irish. They may not know that the name Tala relates to a language that they've forgotten and that's gone. And all over the entire country you have names, place names, townland names, river names, whatever, going back to the Irish language. They'll never go. Well, these are a couple of websites. Queen's University are building up a dictionary of Old and Middle Irish, and they've got 35,000 words in it at this stage. SIL is an American church-based charity that goes out to different parts of the world and helps identify dying languages. What they mean by dying languages is that there's 3 old people up a mountain in Thailand who speak a language that will be gone when they're gone. And they have a format in which to go in. And again, using those core words, what is your word for mother? What is your word for father? Using those core words to build up a dictionary. And this is a website that, it's an academic website, I'm afraid, that studies the Indo-European languages and writes somewhat academic reports on them. Again, one that talks about the old languages that are dying. It's a website it's only opened about 18 months, so it's building up its resources on languages that are disappearing around the world. Some books I could suggest, and they're all in the library, particularly Jim Mallory's book over on the right-hand side, The Origins of the Irish. These other ones talk about the Celts and a little bit about the language. Mallory's one has excellent sections on the language in that.
For a most interesting talk. Very, very good. Very, very interesting. I'm sorry it was a bit late. I missed some of your talk.
Oh.
But would anyone like to ask John questions?
I thought it was Gráinne Whale and the Queen that spoke. I thought she learned the language to speak to Gráinne
Did
Whale.
Gráinne Whale exist?
I don't know, but that's just what I heard.
That's the point.
Yeah.
It's a story.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The O'Donnell one, the O'Donnell, in other words, the head of the clan, is a genuine one. He went to London for peace talks, and she sold him a pup. He thought he came back. No, his name wasn't Charlie Hyde. He thought he had a deal done, and when he saw the small print, he realised it hadn't been done, and eventually that led to the Battle of Kinsale.
There was a mention of a language down the southwest of Ireland,
Yola.
the southeast, Ola. Is that down in Fort and Bargy? They have a kind of
Yes,
dialect
yes,
down
it's the
there.
same. It's a first cousin to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good. Nobody has any other
The
questions.
flight of the Earls.
Yeah.
How many people actually left? We're talking in thousands.
No, I don't think so. Well, yes and no. I mean, it always amazes me when you go to somewhere in Europe, either France, Germany, or Italy, you come across streets with Irish names. And the last place I was in like that was Bordeaux. Every third street seemed to have an Irish name on it. So, to my knowledge, nobody's ever put a number on it. They'll talk about the chieftain, they'll talk about the wife and the sons and the daughters, but they don't talk about the other retainers that were with them. So certainly hundreds, and probably low thousands. But they were the educated ones. In other words, the ones who were left were not educated. The ones who were left could never read or write. And that's why the language stagnated at that point.
Probably took the tutors with them as well, you see, for the children.
No, I think particularly the priest tutors, they had to go a different route and had difficulty getting a living. And one of the things that came out of that period were the annals of the four masters. You know, the four monks that wound up in Donegal and collected as much as they could and wrote it all into one big book, which are now called the annals of the four masters. So some of the tutors did stay.
They take soldiers with them. It was a
Oh
fighting
yeah,
class,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And the wives and the children were left behind, and they knew nothing.
Yeah, didn't they use?
That was the thing.
And another abandoned family, is it?
But that's what it was. They were all herded up then and sent out to Barbados and
Oh, yeah.
those places.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Or didn't they use the people at the start of it, like, you know what I mean? They took them into battle, and then when the battle got going, didn't they run out of Ireland to fly to the geese? You know what I mean? Didn't O'Neill and O'Donnell
You
from
could put
Ross's
it,
Castle, didn't
yeah,
they run?
you could put it that way. Certainly. But the other thing is also true. They saw that they had no future.
Yeah, but they let the people had put out their head for them, and they let the people
No,
on the
no,
side.
you're right in what you're saying. Their options was to stay and fight and die. They knew if they stood and fought, they'd be wiped out. You know, they would have been killed. So they did a runner. You can't say that they could have taken the people with them. There just wouldn't have been enough ships to take the people with them, or their tribe with them. One of the interesting ones is the MacLeod family. Is it the MacLeod family in Scotland? The Earl MacLeod decided to take his whole tribe with him. And he, I think, is about 13 ships. He fitted them all into 13 ships, wound up in Quebec, and are still there today. But that's the only case that I know of where one of the lords decided to take more than his family or his extended family with him.
What do you think of the theory of St. Paul's letter to the Galatians? They're supposed to be the Celts, aren't they?
Mythology.
Is it?
No, you're right. It goes back to those Celts in Anatolia. There is a connection. I'm trying to remember what it is. Do you remember now? No. There is a connection. I think I might think of it and come back to you before tonight's out.
No, it's just...
No, you're right. The Galatians.
I'm trying to figure out what's myth and what's legend and what's...
No, the Galatians are reckoned to have been a Celtic tribe. And they came out of Anatolia, which is quite close to Palestine. And that part of Turkey, yeah.
What's the name for
Is
Dublin?
this,
The Viking name for Dublin, not Dublin. Dublin.
But that was their spelling of pronunciation of the old Dublin. Where is the Dublin?
The Blackpool.
It's the Blackpool.
Where is it?
In Dublin Castle there.
Yeah, it's in Dublin Castle, that nice lawn.
Yes.
They have tried umpteen times to build something on it. And every time they put a foundation down, it goes down. And when they redid Dunn Stores there in South Great Georgia Street, what did they find on that side?
A Viking burial.
A load of Viking burials.
A load of what, sorry?
The question was, the Viking name for Dublin of Dublin really goes back to the old Irish word of dove, the black pool. And my comment was the black pool is actually that lawn at the back of Dublin Castle in front of Marsh's Library. Marsh's Library? No, the coach house. What you call it? Chesterfield. And they've never been able to build on that lawn. There are no foundations.
It's formed by the puddle which rises just up the road under the hospital.
This lad here is after taking recording it. Is it available or?
Yeah, it'll be on the website, Tala Historical Society.
Okay.
Now it might be sort of 2 more weeks,
Oh,
but
that's
if you go into the Tala Historical Society, you will get it there.
And every week you leave it unwatched, the price goes up. Is it 2 pints in...
2 pints, yeah.
Yeah, and then 3 pints if you leave it 3 weeks. 4 pints if you leave it 4 weeks. You don't want to go home.
Just interested in the one.
I don't know if you expected that as a story about the Irish language, but that's my story. Did you do a wrong?